It's a strange thing, the way the world feels at 3 in the morning. The air is heavier, the silence deeper, and the shadows seem to move with a mind of their own. Most people are asleep, tucked away in their beds, dreaming of things they'll forget by sunrise. But for some of us, 3 in the morning is a time we'll never forget. It's the hour when the world slips, just a little, and something else presses in from the other side. I used to think stories about 3 a.m. were just urban legends, the kind of thing you tell at sleepovers to scare your friends. But then it happened to me. And after that, I started collecting stories, from real people, about what happens when you answer the door at 3 a.m. The first story comes from a small town in northern Maine, a place where the winters are long and the nights are longer. The storyteller, a woman named Claire, was a nurse who worked the night shift at the local hospital. She lived alone in a little house at the edge of the woods, the kind of place that's cozy in the daytime, but feels isolated and exposed when the sun goes down. Claire was used to coming home late, used to the quiet and the dark. But one night, she came home to something she couldn't explain. It was a Thursday, she told me, and she'd just finished a 12-hour shift. The roads were slick with ice, and her headlights cut through the fog like knives. She parked in her driveway, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling metal. The woods pressed close on either side, branches heavy with snow. She gathered her things, locked the car, and hurried up the path to her front door. The porch light flickered as she fumbled with her keys, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move at the edge of the trees. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. Inside, the house was cold and still. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her shoes, and went to the kitchen to make tea. The clock on the stove read 2:47. She sipped her tea, staring out the window at the blackness beyond. The woods were silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. She tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion. She finished her tea, washed the cup, and went to bed. She woke to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the house. She sat up, heart pounding, and looked at the clock. 3:01 a.m. The knocking came again, louder this time. She slipped out of bed, her feet cold on the hardwood floor, and crept down the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the porch. She peered through the peephole, expecting to see nothing. But there was someone standing on her porch. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap pulled low over his face. He stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, staring straight ahead. Claire's first thought was that he'd been in an accident, or maybe his car had broken down. But there were no cars on the road, and no footprints in the snow leading up to her porch. She hesitated, her hand on the lock. The man knocked again, 3 times, each knock perfectly spaced. She called out, "Can I help you?" Her voice sounded small and shaky in the quiet. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, unmoving. Claire's skin prickled with fear. She thought about calling the police, but something stopped her. The man knocked a 3rd time, and this time he spoke. His voice was low and flat, almost mechanical. "Let me in. It's cold." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from the door, her heart racing. "I can call someone for you," she said, but the man didn't respond. He just kept staring at the door, as if he could see her through the wood. She backed away, moving down the hallway, her eyes never leaving the door. The man knocked again, harder this time. "Let me in." Claire ran to the kitchen, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911. The operator answered, but before Claire could speak, the line went dead. She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. No signal. She tried again, but the phone wouldn't connect. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in. It's cold. Let me in." Claire ran to the back door, thinking she could slip out and run to a neighbor's house. But when she opened the door, she saw footprints in the snow, fresh footprints, leading from the woods to her back porch. She slammed the door shut, locked it, and pressed her back against the wood. The knocking at the front door stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. The footsteps moved around the house, crunching through the snow. Claire held her breath, listening as the footsteps circled the house, stopping outside each window. She crouched in the kitchen, clutching her phone, praying for the sun to rise. The footsteps stopped outside the kitchen window. Claire looked up, and for a moment, she saw a face pressed against the glass, pale, expressionless, eyes black as coal. She screamed, stumbling back, and the face disappeared. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. Claire waited, frozen with fear, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When she finally dared to look outside, there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But she never forgot the face at the window, or the voice that whispered, "Let me in." The second story comes from a man named Jordan, who grew up in a suburb outside of Chicago. He was the kind of person who never believed in ghosts or monsters, the kind who laughed at horror movies and rolled his eyes at superstitions. But all that changed one night when he was 17, home alone for the first time in his life. His parents had gone out of town for a wedding, leaving him in charge of the house and the family dog, a golden retriever named Max. It was early spring, the kind of night when the air is thick with the promise of rain and the world feels restless. Jordan spent the evening playing video games, eating junk food, and texting his friends. By midnight, he was starting to feel tired, so he let Max out into the backyard one last time before heading upstairs to bed. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Jordan brushed his teeth, checked the locks on the doors, and climbed into bed. He scrolled through his phone for a while, then drifted off to sleep. He woke to the sound of Max barking. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but the barking grew louder, more frantic. Jordan sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked at the clock. 3:04 a.m. He groaned, annoyed, and got out of bed. The barking was coming from downstairs, near the front door. Jordan padded down the hallway, the floor cold beneath his feet, and peered over the banister. Max was standing at the door, his fur bristling, teeth bared, barking at something on the other side. Jordan flipped on the porch light and looked through the peephole. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw a figure standing on the porch. It was a woman, barefoot and wearing a thin white nightgown, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. She was shivering, her arms wrapped around herself, and her eyes were wide with fear. Jordan's annoyance faded, replaced by concern. He opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on, and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman looked up at him, her eyes huge and glassy. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can I come in? Someone's after me." Jordan hesitated. Every instinct told him to help her, but something about the way she stood there, so still and silent, made his skin crawl. Max growled, low and deep, his hackles raised. Jordan glanced down at the dog, then back at the woman. "I can call the police for you," he said, but she shook her head violently. "No, please, just let me in. He's coming. He's almost here." Her voice was desperate, pleading, but her eyes never left his face. Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. He looked past her, scanning the yard for any sign of another person, but the street was empty, the night silent except for the distant rumble of thunder. "Who's coming?" he asked, but the woman didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes unblinking. Max barked again, louder this time, and the woman flinched. Jordan's hand hovered over the lock, torn between fear and compassion. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the woman's expression changed. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she began to convulse, her body jerking in unnatural spasms. Jordan recoiled, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stumbled back, heart racing, as Max barked and scratched at the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then Jordan heard a new sound, a slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. He crept to the window and peered through the blinds. The woman was gone. In her place stood a man, tall and thin, his face hidden in shadow. He wore a dark suit, his hands pressed flat against the glass. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. The man smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. He tapped on the glass again, each tap perfectly timed, like a metronome. Jordan backed away, grabbing his phone and dialing 911. The call wouldn't go through. No signal. He tried again, but the phone was dead. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Max whimpered, backing away from the door. Jordan ran upstairs, locking himself in his room. He could hear footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, moving from window to window. The tapping followed him, always just behind, always just out of sight. He hid in his closet, clutching Max to his chest, listening as the footsteps circled the house. The tapping never stopped, never slowed. It was as if the man knew exactly where he was, as if he could see through the walls. Jordan stayed there until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When he finally dared to look outside, the porch was empty. But on the glass, smeared in something dark and sticky, were the words, "Next time, let me in." Jordan never saw the woman or the man again. But every night, at exactly 3:04 a.m., Max would wake up and stare at the door, growling at something only he could see. The third story comes from a man named Luis, who grew up in a small apartment above his family's bakery in Queens, New York. Luis was the oldest of 3 siblings, and he'd always been the responsible one. The one who locked the doors at night, who checked the windows, who made sure his little sisters were safe before he went to bed. The bakery was their life, and the apartment above it was their sanctuary, a place filled with the smells of fresh bread and the warmth of family. But one night, that sense of safety was shattered forever. It was the summer before Luis left for college. The city was in the grip of a heat wave, and the air conditioners in the apartment rattled and groaned, barely keeping the rooms cool. His parents had gone to visit relatives in New Jersey, leaving Luis in charge for the weekend. He didn't mind. He liked the quiet, the chance to stay up late and watch movies with his sisters, Maria and Sophia. That Saturday night, they made popcorn and watched old horror movies until the girls fell asleep on the couch, curled up together like kittens. Luis carried them to their beds, tucked them in, and went back to the living room. He checked the locks on the doors, made sure the bakery alarm was set, and turned off the lights. The city outside was restless, sirens wailing in the distance, the hum of traffic never quite fading. He lay on the couch, scrolling through his phone, the blue light flickering across his face. At some point, he drifted off, lulled by the familiar sounds of the city. He woke to the sound of the doorbell. It was a harsh, insistent buzz, echoing through the apartment. Luis sat up, disoriented, and looked at the clock on the wall. 3 a.m. He frowned, rubbing his eyes. No one ever came to the bakery at this hour, not even the delivery drivers. The bell rang again, longer this time, as if someone was leaning on the button. Luis got up, his heart pounding, and crept to the window overlooking the street. Below, the sidewalk was empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. He couldn't see anyone at the door. He hesitated, then went downstairs, moving quietly so he wouldn't wake his sisters. The bakery was dark, the only light coming from the neon sign in the window. Luis peered through the peephole in the door, but saw nothing but the empty street. He was about to turn away when the bell rang again, so loud it made him jump. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. Then he heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the tiles. Luis's skin prickled with fear. He called out, "Who's there?" His voice echoed in the empty bakery. No answer. He waited, holding his breath. The shuffling grew louder, closer. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Luis backed away from the door, his heart racing. He thought about calling the police, but something told him not to. He went back upstairs, double-checking the locks, and sat on the couch, listening. The apartment was silent, the only sound the whir of the air conditioner. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just a prank or a lost delivery driver. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He was about to go back to bed when he heard footsteps on the fire escape outside his window. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer and closer. Luis froze, staring at the window. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow pass by. He grabbed his phone, ready to call for help, but the screen was black. Dead. He tried the landline, but there was no dial tone. The footsteps stopped outside his window. Luis held his breath, listening. Then, slowly, the window slid open. A hand reached inside, pale and thin, fingers curling around the frame. Luis stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The hand withdrew, and for a moment, there was silence. Then he heard a voice, soft and whispery, coming from the fire escape. "Let me in, Luis. It's so hot out here. Let me in." Luis's blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded familiar, like someone he'd known a long time ago. He crept to his sister's room, checking to make sure they were still asleep. Maria stirred, mumbling in her sleep, but Sophia was wide awake, her eyes wide with fear. "Luis," she whispered, "there's someone at the window." He nodded, pressing a finger to his lips. They huddled together in the dark, listening as the voice moved from window to window, always just out of sight. "Let me in. Please, let me in." The voice grew more desperate, more insistent, but Luis never opened the door, never answered the window. When the sun finally rose, the voice was gone, and the city was waking up. But on the fire escape, scratched into the metal, were the words, "Next time, you will." The fourth story comes from a woman named Evelyn, who lived most of her life in a quiet, rural town in the Midwest. She was a retired schoolteacher, widowed for nearly a decade, and her days were filled with gardening, reading, and the occasional visit from her grown children. Her house sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by fields that stretched out to the horizon. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, where the biggest excitement was the annual county fair or a thunderstorm rolling in from the west. But one night, Evelyn learned that even the safest places can become strange and dangerous at 3 a.m. It was late autumn, and the wind rattled the windows as Evelyn sat in her favorite armchair, knitting a scarf for her granddaughter. She'd always been a night owl, and she liked the peace and quiet of the house after dark. The only light came from the lamp beside her chair, casting a warm glow over the room. Outside, the fields were shrouded in mist, and the trees creaked in the wind. Evelyn finished another row, set her knitting aside, and stood to make herself a cup of tea. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she glanced at the clock on the stove. 2:58 a.m. She smiled to herself, thinking she should probably go to bed soon. She poured the hot water over her tea bag, added a splash of milk, and carried the cup back to her chair. She was just settling in when she heard it, a soft, tentative knock at the front door. It was so quiet she almost thought she imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. Evelyn's first thought was that it must be one of her neighbors, maybe someone in trouble or a lost traveler. She set her tea down and walked to the door, her slippers whispering across the hardwood floor. She peered through the peephole, but the porch was empty. She hesitated, then called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. She waited, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Just as she was about to turn away, the knock came again, this time from the back door. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. She moved quietly through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The back door was locked, the porch light off. She flicked the switch, illuminating the small stoop outside. There was no one there. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet through the leaves. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. She dialed her daughter's number, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. She tried the landline, but it was dead. The knocking started again, this time at the side door. It was louder now, more insistent. Evelyn backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She locked herself in the bathroom, clutching the phone to her chest, listening as the knocking moved from door to door, window to window, always just out of sight. She sat in the dark, her mind racing. She thought about her husband, about the years they'd spent in this house, about the nights they'd sat together on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the fields. She wondered if she was losing her mind, if the loneliness and the quiet had finally gotten to her. But then she heard a voice, soft and pleading, coming from the other side of the bathroom door. "Please, let me in. I'm so cold. Please, Evelyn." The voice was familiar, achingly so. It sounded like her husband, gone these 10 years. Evelyn's heart ached with longing and fear. She pressed her hand to the door, tears streaming down her face. "You can't be here," she whispered. "You're gone." The voice grew more desperate, more insistent. "Please, Evelyn, let me in. I miss you. I need you." Evelyn closed her eyes, willing herself to be strong. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell, stories about spirits and things that walk the earth at night, looking for a way back in. She stayed in the bathroom until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When she finally opened the door, the house was silent. But on the bathroom mirror, written in the steam, were the words, "Next time, you'll answer." Evelyn never told her children what happened that night. But every year, on the anniversary of her husband's death, she hears the knocking again, always at 3 a.m., always followed by that familiar, impossible voice. The fifth story is from a college student named Marcus, who attended a small liberal arts school in Vermont. Marcus was a skeptic, a rationalist, the kind of person who always looked for the logical explanation first. He loved debunking ghost stories and urban legends, and he'd made a bit of a name for himself on campus as the guy who could explain away anything strange. But there are some things that logic can't touch, and Marcus learned that the hard way one bitterly cold night in February. It was the middle of winter break, and most of the students had gone home. Marcus stayed behind to work on his senior thesis, enjoying the solitude of the nearly empty dorms. The campus was blanketed in snow, the trees heavy with ice, and the only sounds were the wind rattling the windows and the distant hum of the heating system. Marcus's room was on the third floor, overlooking the quad, and he liked to sit by the window, watching the snow fall and the world grow quiet. That night, he stayed up late, lost in his research. The clock on his laptop read 2:45 a.m. when he finally decided to call it quits. He stretched, yawned, and went to brush his teeth. The hallway was silent, the lights dimmed to save energy. As he walked back to his room, he heard footsteps echoing behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of the few other students who'd stayed behind, but the hallway was empty. He shrugged it off, blaming his tired mind, and went back to his room. He was just about to climb into bed when he heard a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it came again, louder and more insistent. Marcus frowned, glancing at the clock. 3 a.m. He hesitated, then called out, "Who is it?" No answer. He opened the door a crack, peering into the hallway. It was empty. He stepped out, looking left and right, but there was no one there. He was about to close the door when he heard it again, a knock, this time from the end of the hallway. Marcus walked toward the sound, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows deepening with every step. He reached the end of the hall, but there was no one there. Just as he turned to go back, he heard a knock behind him, at the door to the stairwell. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He opened the stairwell door, but the stairs were empty, the only sound the wind howling through the cracks in the old windows. He started back to his room, but the knocking followed him, always just ahead, always just out of sight. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the building settling, just the wind. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to be coming from every door, every wall. He locked himself in his room, trying to drown out the sound with music, but the knocking only grew louder. Then he heard a voice, soft and cold, whispering through the walls. "Let me in, Marcus. I'm so tired. Let me in." Marcus's blood ran cold. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice only grew louder, more desperate. "Let me in. Please, let me in." He tried to call campus security, but his phone was dead. The landline was dead, too. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The knocking was everywhere now, pounding on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Marcus curled up on his bed, shaking with fear, as the voice whispered in his ear, "Let me in. I need you." He stayed like that until the sun rose, the knocking fading with the first light of day. When he finally dared to open the door, the hallway was empty. But on the wall outside his room, written in what looked like frost, were the words, "Next time, you'll open the door." Marcus never tried to explain away what happened that night. He left school at the end of the semester, and he never stayed up past midnight again. After hearing these stories, you might think they're just coincidences, the kind of strange, unsettling events that happen in the dead of night and are quickly forgotten by morning. But the truth is, there's a pattern, a thread that runs through each of these encounters, binding them together in ways that are hard to ignore. It's not just the hour, or the knocking, or the voices that plead to be let in. It's the feeling that something is waiting on the other side of the door, something that knows your name, your fears, your secrets. Something that's been watching, waiting for the moment when you're most vulnerable. I started to notice the pattern after my own experience. I'd always been a skeptic, like Marcus, quick to dismiss anything that didn't fit neatly into the world I understood. But after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brushed up against something ancient and hungry, something that didn't care whether I believed in it or not. I began to collect stories, reaching out to people who'd had similar experiences, piecing together the fragments of their memories. The more I listened, the more I realized that these encounters weren't isolated incidents. They were warnings. One of the first things I noticed was how the stories always began the same way. The kind that settles over a house when the world is holding its breath. Sometimes it was a flicker of movement at the edge of the light, a shadow that didn't belong. And always, it was followed by the knocking. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, echoing through the darkness. It didn't matter where you lived or who you were. The knocking found you. I spoke to a woman named Grace, who lived in a high-rise apartment in the city. She was a night owl, used to the sounds of traffic and sirens. But one night, she woke to a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped. She lay in bed, listening, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she heard it. The knocking, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. She got up, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. But the knocking continued, moving from door to door, window to window, always just out of sight. Grace told me she felt like she was being hunted, like something was circling her apartment, looking for a way in. She tried to call for help, but her phone was dead. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging her into darkness. She hid in the bathroom, listening as the knocking grew louder, more desperate. Then she heard a voice, soft and pleading, whispering her name. "Let me in, Grace. Please, let me in." She stayed in the bathroom until the sun rose, the knocking fading with the first light of day. When she finally dared to look outside, there was nothing there. But on the mirror, written in condensation, were the words, "Next time, you'll answer." I heard stories like this again and again from people all over the country. Some lived in cities, some in the middle of nowhere. Some were young, some old. But the details were always the same. The knocking, the voice, the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the door. And always the warning, "Next time." I started to wonder what would happen if someone did open the door. Most people I spoke to said they never did, that something deep inside them told them not to. But a few, just a handful, admitted that they'd given in, that they'd opened the door to whatever was waiting on the other side. Their stories were different, darker, harder to hear. They spoke of things that didn't make sense, of memories that didn't belong to them, of dreams that bled into waking life. They spoke of voices that whispered in the dark, of shadows that moved on their own, of a hunger that grew inside them, gnawing at the edges of their minds. One man, who asked me not to use his name, told me that after he opened the door, he started to see things, faces in the mirror that weren't his own, reflections that moved when he stood still. He said he felt like he was being watched, like something had followed him home. He moved 3 times in 6 months, but the knocking always found him, always at 3 a.m., always with the same plea, "Let me in." I don't know what's waiting on the other side of the door. I don't know if it's a ghost, a demon, or something older and stranger than anything we can imagine. But I do know this. If you hear knocking at 3 a.m., if you hear a voice whispering your name, don't answer. Don't open the door. No matter how much it begs, no matter how much it sounds like someone you love. Because once you let it in, it never leaves. Some people say that fear is just a trick of the mind, a leftover instinct from when we lived in caves and had to watch for predators in the dark. But the kind of fear that comes with a knock at 3 a.m. is different. It's not the fear of something you can see or touch. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear that something is out there, waiting for you to make a mistake. It's the fear that maybe, just maybe, the stories are true. After months of collecting these stories, I started to notice something else, a strange sense of connection between the people who'd experienced the knocking. They all described the same feelings, a sense of being watched, a heaviness in the air, a cold that seeped into their bones. Some said they started having nightmares, dreams where they wandered through empty streets, searching for something they couldn't name. Others said they felt drawn to the door, as if something was calling to them, pulling them closer with every passing night. I spoke to a man named David, who lived in a small house on the edge of a forest. He was a quiet man, not given to flights of fancy, but his story chilled me to the core. He said the knocking started one winter night, just after his wife passed away. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch tapping against the window. But the knocking grew louder, more persistent, always at the same time, 3 a.m. on the dot. David tried everything to make it stop. He changed the locks, boarded up the windows, even slept with a baseball bat by his bed. But the knocking never stopped. It followed him from room to room, always just out of reach. He said the worst part was the voice. It sounded like his wife, calling to him from the other side of the door. "Let me in, David. It's so cold out here. Please, let me in." He knew it couldn't be her, but the longing in her voice was almost too much to bear. One night, he almost gave in. He stood at the door, his hand on the lock, tears streaming down his face. But something stopped him, a memory, maybe, or a warning from deep inside. He stepped away from the door, and the voice turned angry, then desperate, then silent. The next morning, he found scratches on the wood, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. David told me he never answered the door again, no matter how much it begged. But he said the knocking changed him. He started seeing things in the corners of his eyes, shadows that moved when he looked away. He heard whispers in the night, voices that sounded like people he'd lost. He said he felt like he was living in two worlds at once, the world of the living and the world of whatever waited outside his door. I heard similar stories from others. A woman in Texas who said the knocking followed her from house to house, always finding her no matter where she went. A teenager in Oregon who said the voice sounded like her best friend, who died in a car accident the year before. A man in Florida who said the knocking started after he survived a near-fatal heart attack, as if something had been waiting for him on the other side and was angry he'd come back. The more stories I heard, the more I started to wonder if the knocking was a test, a way for something to see who would let it in, who would open the door and invite it into their lives. Maybe it was looking for something or someone. Maybe it was just hungry. Or maybe it was just lonely, wandering the world in the dead of night, looking for a way back in. I started to keep a journal, writing down every story, every detail, every pattern I could find. I mapped out the locations, the dates, the times. I looked for connections, for clues, for anything that might explain what was happening. But the only thing I found was this. The knocking always came at 3 a.m., always with the same plea, always leaving behind the same sense of dread. I don't know if there's a way to stop it. I don't know if there's a way to protect yourself, other than to never answer the door, no matter how much it begs. But I do know this. If you ever hear knocking at 3 a.m., if you ever hear a voice that sounds like someone you love, don't answer. Don't open the door. Because once you do, you can never go back. I started to wonder if the knocking was older than any of us realized. Maybe it was something that had always been here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I dug deeper, searching through old newspapers, library archives, and forgotten corners of the internet. What I found only made the stories more chilling. There were reports from decades ago, even centuries, of people hearing strange knocks in the night. In a faded newspaper clipping from 1923, a family in rural Pennsylvania described a series of nights when someone, or something, knocked on their door at exactly 3 a.m. The father, a stern man who didn't believe in nonsense, finally opened the door on the third night. He vanished without a trace, leaving behind only muddy footprints on the porch and a terrified family. The police never found him, and the story faded into local legend. In a diary from 1897, a young woman in London wrote about a persistent rapping at her window every night at the same hour. She described the feeling of being watched, of hearing her mother's voice calling to her from the darkness, even though her mother had died years before. The diary ended abruptly. The last entry is a single, desperate line. "I must let her in. She's so cold." Even older stories surfaced, tales from the Middle Ages, from ancient villages where people whispered about the night visitor, a spirit that wandered from house to house, knocking and pleading to be let inside. The stories always ended the same way, with someone missing or changed or never quite themselves again. I realized that the knocking wasn't just a modern phenomenon. It was something woven into the fabric of our fears, a shadow that stretched across generations. Maybe it was a spirit, or a demon, or something else entirely. Maybe it was just the darkness itself, given voice and form by our own loneliness and longing. But whatever it was patient. It could wait years, decades, even centuries for someone to make the mistake of opening the door. I started to see the signs everywhere. In old folk songs, in fairy tales, in the stories parents told their children to keep them safe at night. "Don't answer the door after midnight," they'd say. "Don't listen to the voices in the dark." It was always the same warning, passed down from generation to generation, a thread of fear that connected us all. I spoke to a folklorist, a woman named Dr. Harper, who'd spent her life studying stories like these. She told me that every culture has its own version of the knocking. Sometimes it's a lost loved one, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a creature with no face at all. But the message is always the same. The door is a boundary, a line between the world we know and the world we fear. To open it is to invite something in, something that doesn't belong. Dr. Harper said that the knocking is a test, a way for the darkness to see if we're paying attention. It's not just about fear, she told me. It's about trust, about knowing who to let in and who to keep out. The knocking is a reminder that not everything that asks for your help deserves it. Her words stayed with me. I thought about all the people who'd told me their stories, about the ones who'd resisted and the ones who hadn't. I wondered what it was that made some people open the door and others keep it shut. Was it loneliness? Curiosity? Desperation? Or was it something deeper, something we can't even name? I started to pay more attention to my own life, to the moments when I felt that strange sense of unease, that prickling at the back of my neck. I listened for the sounds in the night, the creaks and groans of the house settling, the wind rattling the windows. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. It could wait years, decades, even centuries for someone to make the mistake of opening the door. I started to see the signs everywhere. In old folk songs, in fairy tales, in the stories parents told their children to keep them safe at night. Don't answer the door after midnight, they'd say. Don't listen to the voices in the dark. It was always the same warning, passed down from generation to generation, a thread of fear that connected us all. I spoke to a folklorist, a woman named Dr. Harper, who'd spent her life studying stories like these. She told me that every culture has its own version of the knocking. Sometimes it's a lost loved one, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a creature with no face at all. But the message is always the same. The door is a boundary, a line between the world we know and the world we fear. To open it is to invite something in, something that doesn't belong. Dr. Harper said that the knocking is a test, a way for the darkness to see if we're paying attention. It's not just about fear, she told me. It's about trust, about knowing who to let in and who to keep out. The knocking is a reminder that not everything that asks for your help deserves it. Her words stayed with me. I thought about all the people who'd told me their stories, about the ones who'd resisted and the ones who hadn't. I wondered what it was that made some people open the door and others keep it shut. Was it loneliness? Curiosity? Desperation? Or was it something deeper, something we can't even name? I started to pay more attention to my own life, to the moments when I felt that strange sense of unease, that prickling at the back of my neck. I listened for the sounds in the night, the creaks and groans of the house settling, the wind rattling the windows. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But sometimes, when the world was quiet and the clock crept toward 3, I thought I heard it, the soft, insistent knocking, just beyond the edge of sleep. I never answered. I never opened the door. But I kept listening, kept collecting stories, kept searching for answers. Because I knew that as long as the knocking continued, as long as people kept hearing those voices in the dark, the story wasn't over. It was still being written, one night at a time, in houses and apartments and dorm rooms all over the world. And maybe, just maybe, the next story would be mine. As the stories piled up, I started to notice how the knocking changed people. It wasn't just the fear or the sleepless nights. It was something deeper, something that lingered long after the sun came up and the world returned to normal. People became quieter, more withdrawn. They stopped trusting their own senses, second-guessing every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of their vision. Some moved away, hoping distance would keep the knocking at bay. Others tried to forget, burying the memory under layers of routine and denial. But the fear never really left. I remember talking to a woman named Priya, who lived in a bustling city apartment, surrounded by neighbors and noise. She told me that after the knocking, she couldn't sleep without the lights on. She started leaving the TV running all night, just to drown out the silence. She said she felt like she was being watched, even in a crowd. "It's like something followed me home," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Like it's waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. I know it's not real, but I can't shake the feeling." Priya's story wasn't unique. I heard the same thing from people all over, men and women, young and old, city dwellers and country folk. The knocking left a mark, a scar that didn't show on the outside but changed everything on the inside. Some people became obsessed, searching for answers, trying to find a way to make sense of what had happened. Others shut down, refusing to talk about it, pretending it never happened. But no one ever really moved on. I started to wonder if the knocking was more than just a test or a warning. Maybe it was a kind of infection, a seed of fear planted deep inside, growing stronger with every sleepless night. Maybe that was the real danger, not what was waiting outside the door, but what it left behind when it couldn't get in. The fear, the doubt, the sense that the world wasn't as safe or as simple as we wanted it to be. I thought about my own experience, about the way it haunted me long after the night was over. I found myself checking the locks 3, 4, 5 times before bed. I jumped at every unexpected sound, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows. I started to avoid mirrors at night, afraid of what I might see looking back at me. I told myself it was just nerves, just the power of suggestion, but deep down I knew better. The knocking had changed me, too. One night, I got an email from a man named Tom. He said he'd heard about my project and wanted to share his story. He lived alone in a small house on the coast, miles from the nearest neighbor. He said the knocking started after his wife died, just like David's story. At first, he thought it was just grief, his mind playing tricks on him. But the knocking grew louder, more persistent, always at 3 a.m. He said he started to see things, shadows moving in the corners, faces in the windows, reflections that didn't belong to him. Tom said he tried everything to make it stop. He boarded up the doors and windows, slept with a shotgun by his bed, even tried to move away. But the knocking always found him, no matter where he went. He said he started to feel like he was losing his mind, like the world was slipping out from under him. "It's not just the knocking," he wrote. "It's what comes after. The fear, the doubt, the feeling that you're never really alone, no matter how hard you try." His words echoed in my mind. I realized that the knocking wasn't just a story or a legend or a trick of the mind. It was something real, something that left a mark on everyone it touched. Maybe it was a spirit or a curse or just the darkness itself, looking for a way in. Or maybe it was something even older, something that had always been here, waiting for us to let our guard down. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. The knocking was never really gone. It was always out there, waiting for the next door, the next voice, the next mistake. And as long as people kept hearing it, as long as the stories kept coming, the fear would never really fade. I started to think about what it meant to live with that kind of fear. Not the sudden, sharp terror of a nightmare, but the slow, creeping dread that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. It changes the way you see the world. You start to notice things you never paid attention to before, the way the shadows move across the walls at night, the way the wind sounds different after midnight, the way your own reflection sometimes seems to linger a moment too long in the mirror. You start to wonder if you're imagining things, or if something is really there, just out of sight. I talked to a therapist, Dr. Lynn, who specialized in trauma and anxiety. She told me that fear is a powerful force, one that can shape our lives in ways we don't always understand. When people experience something they can't explain, she said, it shakes their sense of reality. They start to question everything. What's real? What's imagined? What's safe? What's dangerous? It's not just about the event itself. It's about what it does to your mind, your sense of self, your trust in the world. Dr. Lynn said that the stories I'd collected were more than just ghost stories. They were a map of our deepest fears, a record of the things that haunt us when the world is quiet and the lights are low. She said that the knocking was a symbol, a way for our minds to make sense of the things we can't control. It's a boundary, she said, a line between what we know and what we don't. When something crosses that line, it changes us. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I thought about that for a long time. I wondered if the knocking was really out there, or if it was something we carried inside us, a shadow that grew stronger the more we tried to ignore it. Maybe it was both, a real thing, and a symbol, feeding off our fear and our loneliness. Maybe that was why it always came at 3 a.m., when the world was at its quietest, when we were most alone with our thoughts. I started to pay attention to my own life, to the ways the knocking had changed me. I found myself reaching out to friends I hadn't spoken to in years, just to hear another voice on the line. I started going for walks during the day, soaking up the sunlight, reminding myself that the world was still a good place, still full of life and laughter and hope. I tried to focus on the things I could control, the locks on the doors, the warmth of my bed, the sound of my own breathing in the dark. But some nights, when the world was quiet and the clock crept toward 3, I still felt it, the weight of the darkness pressing in, the sense that something was waiting just outside, listening for the sound of footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, the turn of a key in the lock. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the stories I collected, but deep down I knew better. They start to question everything. What's real? What's imagined? What's safe? What's dangerous? It's not just about the event itself. It's about what it does to your mind, your sense of self, your trust in the world. Dr. Lynn said that the stories I'd collected were more than just ghost stories. They were a map of our deepest fears, a record of the things that haunt us when the world is quiet and the lights are low. She said that the knocking was a symbol, a way for our minds to make sense of the things we can't control. It's a boundary, she said, a line between what we know and what we don't. When something crosses that line, it changes us. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I thought about that for a long time. I wondered if the knocking was really out there, or if it was something we carried inside us, a shadow that grew stronger the more we tried to ignore it. Maybe it was both, a real thing, and a symbol, feeding off our fear and our loneliness. Maybe that was why it always came at 3 a.m., when the world was at its quietest, when we were most alone with our thoughts. I started to pay attention to my own life, to the ways the knocking had changed me. I found myself reaching out to friends I hadn't spoken to in years, just to hear another voice on the line. I started going for walks during the day, soaking up the sunlight, reminding myself that the world was still a good place, still full of life and laughter and hope. I tried to focus on the things I could control, the locks on the doors, the warmth of my bed, the sound of my own breathing in the dark. But some nights, when the world was quiet and the clock crept toward 3, I still felt it, the weight of the darkness pressing in, the sense that something was waiting just outside, listening for the sound of footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, the turn of a key in the lock. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the stories I collected, but deep down I knew better. The knocking was real, in one way or another, and it was never really gone. I started to write more, to share the stories I'd collected with others. I found that talking about the fear made it easier to bear, that sharing the burden made it lighter. People wrote to me from all over the world, telling me their own stories, their own encounters with the knocking. Some were terrified, some were curious, some were just grateful to know they weren't alone. The stories became a kind of lifeline, a way to connect with others, to remind ourselves that we were all in this together. And maybe that's the real lesson of the knocking. Not that the world is full of monsters, or that we should never trust the darkness, but that we're stronger together, that we can face our fears if we share them, if we talk about them, if we refuse to let them control us. The knocking may never go away, but as long as we keep telling our stories, as long as we keep listening to each other, we can keep it at bay.